Hey everyone, welcome to the Neo Marketing Podcast. My name is Kyle Golding. I'm your co-host along with Pritch Pritchard. And today on this podcast, we're going to talk about podcasts, the importance and how to do it. Welcome to the Golding Group Neo Marketing Podcast, a bi-weekly discussion of modern business communication. Good morning, Pritch. How are you today?
I'm doing great, Kyle. How about yourself?
Fantastic. Happy to have you back again from Europe. We missed you all summer. We're happy you're back.
Thanks, man.
And we're going to talk today on this podcast about podcasts. Something people ask me about a lot. They know not only that we do this podcast, but we're involved in several other podcasts. My personal podcast, the Saturday Morning Hustle.
Right.
We work with our friends out of Washington, D.C. at the American Academy of Diplomacy, promoting their two podcasts, The General and the Ambassador and The American Diplomat, which the American Diplomat just went over 100,000 downloads.
Yeah.
That's amazing.
Nice.
Interesting podcast for sure. Something else I've just started with a good friend of mine, Major Ed Polito, our friend, our inspirational speaker, Purple Heart recipient. He's doing his podcast now on all the things he does in his work with Folds of Honor, Words for Freedom, and his book that he has out, and all the support that he does for veteran groups.
Right.
So it's a huge variety and broad scope of the types of podcasts you can have. And of course, there's all the podcasts everyone's familiar with, right? There's Gary Vaynerchuk, there's Simon Sinek, there's the Serial podcast, which was, of course, all about a murder trial. And there's a lot of comedians doing really well with podcasts. Right. A lot of people have gone there because that's where attention is now, right?
Yeah.
People are paying attention to podcasts. It is back. That's right. There was a time where podcasts sort of jumped up, were popular, sort of went away. Apple sort of did a really good job of bringing it back. Recently kind of restructured how it was on the iTunes store, kind of panicked a lot of people, but it worked out really well.
Right.
And so
somebody else jumped into it in a big way too.
Spotify and iHeartRadio are putting podcasts on their programming as well, because they're traditionally more like regular radio type stations, but podcasts now are part of their offering. Spotify, the same thing. It's not just music. A lot of people have been using SoundCloud for doing the same thing. So there's a ton of varieties and options out there, and there's probably 50 ways you can find this podcast online, and things you can subscribe to as well. Right. So, but there's also about 50, probably more than that, but I'll say, let's give a range of 50 different ways you can produce a podcast.
Right.
And how, and that's the question I get asked a lot, is I kind of want to do a podcast, or I think I should, or someone told me I should, and I just don't know how to execute it. And there's a variety of ways people should do it. So I'm going to go through some of those today.
Cool. You don't have to go spend $100,000 right out of the box.
No, it doesn't have to be a Hollywood movie. It doesn't have to be the slickest thing ever, unless you are a big international brand that rolls like that. You know, if I'm sure Sony has a podcast, maybe I just don't pay attention to it. If Sony or Nike or Apple or any of them have a podcast that represents their brand, it better be slick as hell.
Absolutely.
But if you're a startup, if you're an individual, if you have a self-brand, it doesn't have to be all that. It could be as simple as something you do on your cell phone.
Right.
One of my favorites actually for the Saturday Morning Hustle is I do it on what's called Anchor. It's an Anchor app. It's an app on the phone. Started off real simple. It was almost like a voice note type thing that would then publish to an RSS feed. And our RSS feed is how Apple gets all of their content for podcasts. Right. And that platform has grown greatly over the years. It's free too. Free to use, and now
I like that word.
And now they're helping you monetize. So not only is it free, you can make money on it from a free version.
Yeah,
it's amazing what they've done. But literally, hit record, put the phone to your ear, talk into it, give your podcast presentation, hit stop. You can do background music, bumpers, all of that stuff on a free app.
So on your phone.
Right. So anyone who says I can't afford to make a podcast,
it's free.
It's free. Just have to have a little time and a little initiative to do so.
Yep.
And then, of course, you can move up the scale. So here we have the full-blown build your own studio podcast we just talked about with the major brands, and they should be doing it like that. Then you have the other end of the spectrum, a free phone app, right? That leaves a ton of room in between those things for other things that people can do that fit their business needs or their self-brand, and it fits their budget, and it represents the way that they want it to.
Yeah.
And so I'll touch on some of these, and I'll come back and give you some details. So again, you have the phone app. You can do a more elaborate setup with with microphones, with headphones, etc., but probably using off a smart device. Then you get into a simple setup like this. We make ours a little bit more complicated because we do the video portion of it as well.
Right.
But essentially what we have here are two microphones. They're independent recorders, so they're not even run through a console into another recorder that we sync up later using some software. So I find it actually to be one of the simpler ones. I did that on purpose. I intentionally wanted this podcast to be as simple of a setup as possible.
Right.
Really, because one of the things I was hoping to do when we started was to go more places.
Right.
We've done that a little. I like to do more of that.
Right.
It works when we do the Oklahoma Venture Forum podcast.
Yes.
When we forgot from the top, right? We interview the speakers for the Oklahoma Venture Forum every month. Turn that into a podcast. We take this setup because it's simple enough.
It's very portable.
With GoPros and with the portable microphone recorders and set up podcast recording as well,
studio.
Right?
Yeah.
So that's the simpler end of it. Of course, you can have a more dedicated, complex studio, if you will, if your podcast is just you. If it's set up to always have guests or to have co-hosts like we have. If you have people constantly coming in as guests, you have to worry about the logistics of how they show up and how to manage all that process.
Right.
But I've seen podcasts that are done on a couch, that are done at a desk, at a desk sitting side by side, at a table across like what we're doing. Everyone's sitting together on a couch. All kinds of variations of what's the podcast look like. On the go, people walking, doing interviews just as they walk. I'm walking to lunch. Let's have a conversation. So again, the format can be whatever it needs to be if it makes sense for you and it makes sense for the topic and for the representation of your brand. Right. That's the key.
Well, and that atmosphere, I'm quite certain, needs to be authentic. Authentic to who you are, authentic to your brand, authentic to what you want to try and get done.
Right.
People will see through artifice.
Yes. So it has to be authentic, and then it has to bring return on the value, right? It has to bring the ROI. You can't spend $10,000 an episode on a podcast that 6 people are listening to and is generating no business.
Right.
At the same time, going back to the conversation about authenticity, if it's a pure sales pitch, which becomes a commercial or an infomercial, and who wants to listen to an infomercial?
Nobody.
Right. So it can't be a pure sales play. It needs to be a conversation about what you do, about what your audience is interested in, and ways that you can have conversations that aren't sales pitches, much like how PR is not a sales pitch, but it's a conversation about what your brand is, who you are, what you represent, etc. That needs to be the idea behind a podcast. If you can do that and have it make it conversational, something we learned from our research, right?
Absolutely.
For our clients is that people are looking for authentic, conversational stories that they can't get elsewhere. They're not looking for advertising. They're not looking for infomercials. Even ones that are a lot more kind of scientifically based, whether it's scientists talking to each other or mathematicians, et cetera. Even the political ones too, right? When you get into political science and things like that are very academic. It's not about reading from a book.
Right.
It's about having a conversation.
Exactly.
So understanding what your brand represents, what you're trying to do, provide for your audience. Then you have the technical aspects. Like I said, simple as a phone app through a full studio. You can go into studios. Like our friends in DC, they produce out of the Podcast Village, which is a dedicated space. They get to come in. It's all set up. They sit down. They have a conversation. They stand up and leave. The people at Podcast Village take care of everything for them and make it into a package that's ready for them. The convenience and the speed and the fact that it's always technically correct is what they're makes sense for their operation.
Right.
So some brands, I think, probably are set up that way where they could utilize a studio, a dedicated podcast studio, or a dedicated space in their building to do so. I know a lot of the co-working spaces now are offering podcast studios as well because low cost entry of doing your own show in a studio, or whether it's in your own office or in a co-working space, makes it more potential for that positive ROI.
You mentioned earlier, though, we've done some research on this. We did this for one of our clients, and it was interesting, I think, to both of us to know that it was the production quality wasn't the driver of being engaged.
Exactly.
It was the hosts and it was the stories.
It was the content.
It's the content.
Right. Which goes back to that conversation of it could be as simple as what we're doing here. It could be a phone app, and it could be something you do walking down the street or something man on the street type interviews, if you will.
Right.
Any of that is plausible. Obviously, it has to be audible. Like you have to be able to understand and listen. And it's not, grating sounds and high-pitched frequencies and stuff like that.
Yeah.
But at an acceptable level of production, depending on what you're trying to do and who your audience is, it doesn't have to be super slick. It can be very raw if that's what you're going for, which is a man on the street interview, right? Right. It's going to randomly ask someone some questions, right, and we're going to hear their real opinion on something.
Right.
Then that should be it shouldn't be really overproduced. It should be very spur of the moment, very authentic, as it happens type production.
Natural sound, the whole thing, yeah.
For something like what we're doing, where we're really trying to convey some information when we're talking about marketing, strategy, public relations, business development, audience, etc. Sometimes we get a little bit technical, a little bit jargon, a little bit kind of behind the scenes, and the intent is to be educational. And so we do need to be able to be clearly deliver and something that you can listen to, maybe even back up and listen again and make sure that you're hearing it correctly.
Right.
And then also being able to find the episodes, be able to see the description, see what's being talked about, subscribe, etc. That's all important for the type of podcast we're doing.
Right.
So it takes that authentic approach, but the production value isn't based on how slick it is outside of representing your brand image.
Right. Yeah.
Which is very interesting, right? So at the end of the day, authentic, real storytelling with interesting content is the key, but isn't that really the key to all marketing? Too many people want to put production value and the slickness of their advertising
ahead of the content.
Well, they think it's a replacement for, and that's a failure in their strategy.
Absolutely.
And it's what happens when people want to start with tactics instead of going to strategy first.
And doing the research.
Right, exactly. Like, we have great video shooters, we have this great photography or whatever, and it's gonna be so slick, it doesn't matter what we say. Wrong. You're more likely to get better response by something with a lower production value, but some real authenticity aimed at the right audience in the right way in a specific factor.
Yeah.
So that's why podcasting is important and interesting and a real tool right now in your marketing tool bag, because people are paying attention to it and you have the potential to connect with your audience.
Yeah, people want to engage with the brand, and a podcast is a perfect way to do that if done correctly.
Right. So don't overthink it. Don't try to get too slick too soon. Here's the other thing too. As I say this, it hit me in my head because this is how I convinced Major Ed to go ahead and do his first podcast and get it rolling.
All right.
No one's going to see podcast episode 7 or 50 or 99 and go, this is great, but your first one stunk, so never mind. Right. You know, how many times have you watched, the first episode of a TV show and then eventually you go, I kind of like this, that first one not so good.
Right.
So don't get caught up in perfection. Perfect is the enemy of good, right?
It's the mortal enemy of good enough.
That's right. Absolutely, when it comes to podcasting, no one expects your first show to be awesome. Just do it. You can even start with the phone app. Start with the most entry-level version of your podcast.
Right.
Start doing it. Gauge your audience reactions. Ask them for their audience. Ask your audience to let you know what they like, feedback, etc. on the podcast itself, on social media. Take that feedback, craft the podcast around what your audience is looking for, but do not think, I don't have it perfect, I don't have a fancy intro, I don't have lights, I don't even have video. Whatever it is that you're telling yourself right now you can't do a podcast because you don't have that, that's BS.
Yeah.
You can do it. If you got a smartphone, you can make a podcast. Make the first one, make the second one. Start creating consistency. Look for audience reaction. Look for their feedback, and incorporate that into what you're doing. Tailor your approach to what people are reacting to, and just do it. If you're going to spend $1 million on an ad campaign, you have to be perfect. You have to cross every T and dot every I and make sure you're absolutely on spot before you sign that $1 million check.
Right.
But we're talking about things you can do free or very low cost. It's really about your attention and your energy doing it. So just do it. Get started.
The other thing that our research showed is that frequency doesn't matter as much as you think it would, and that goes to what you're saying.
And I was very surprised by that, because that's one of the things. Consistency is a big, on my marketing matrix, consistency is always very high. So I found that information from the research interesting. Yeah. So dive a little deeper into that.
It's less important. People, if they know where to find the podcast, they're engaging with it. Obviously, they're subscribing. They're less concerned about it being every week or every other week, as long as when it comes, it's good.
Right. And authentic and what they expect it to be.
Yeah. So sometimes I think it's an impediment to getting podcasts started, oh my God, I'm going to have to do this every week.
Right.
No, you do it whenever you've got good content to do it, and eventually you'll get into a rhythm.
Right.
But the rhythm is less important than to listeners, podcast listeners, than the content and the hosts.
So here's what you guys can take from all the research we've done for multiple clients. We've found this trend over and over again. So take this. Number one, it's not about production value. It's about authentic storytelling.
Yes.
So focus on that. Don't worry about your cost. Number two, just do it.
Just do it.
Get started. It can be inconsistent at first until you find your audience, and that's part of the things you have to work out in that process. And number three is it can change, it can adapt, it can become what the audience needs it to be.
Right.
And then the fourth piece I'm going to add in is this is from our research, but this is common sense, right?
Yeah.
Be patient, folks.
Yeah.
You're not going to become a superstar in episode 4 or episode 7, probably not even episode 70. But eventually, enough people are going to latch on, and you need to have a library of shows. You need to be, for someone to go, that episode was interesting, let me go see what else there is.
Right.
And to catch some of your other past episodes in an easy way to listen, and they say, wow, okay, I'm really hooked now. That's the person most likely to hit that subscribe button, and that's ultimately what we're trying to get as many subscribers as possible, because now you're in a relationship.
Absolutely.
So if you can do those things, don't worry about production value. Get started. Be authentic and focus on storytelling. Do those things. Be patient.
Be patient.
Build, 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 build. Be patient, authentic. Do those things. Just get started. That's the key.
There you go.
Right there.
Perfect timing.
So there you have it, folks. GoPro freaked out. So that's what we're telling you guys this week. Podcasts are cool. Podcasts are awesome. We like podcasts. You like podcasts. You're listening to those podcasts. Go make your own podcast or be a guest on someone else's podcast. Try it out a little bit. See if you like it and have fun with it.
Yep.
That's the main thing. Have some fun with it.
Have some fun with it.
There you go.
There you
so
go.
Until next time, good luck.
Ciao.